For the last few weeks, across social media, there have been viral accounts of the importance of luften, which in the US we have been tending to call house burping. It's where you open up all your windows for a few minutes across seasons just to rapidly try to let in fresh air and let out the air that's accumulated in your house. And there's differences in opinions about exactly how effective this is, and depends a little bit on what you're trying to do if you're airing out your home. But in general, it's not that crazy to try to air out your house once in a while. But it does raise serious questions beyond bringing in fresh air, beyond letting out some of that stale smelling air from our home. What else is in the air in our houses? What other kinds of chemicals might exist in the neutral spaces of our homes? And how can we address some of the concerns that might be related to those? Well, on today's show, we're thinking through one of the most severe cases of indoor air pollution, specifically around formaldehyde in FEMA trailers that were spread across the nation in a way that many never even heard about and didn't know before they were placed into these all over America. So we'll be talking all about that particular case and what it means for broader home air quality concerns across the hour. I'm Weston Twardowski, the Associate Director of Rice's Center for Environmental Studies and Associate Director of Eco Studio in the Rice Sustainability Institute, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Dr. Nicholas Shapiro is Associate Professor of Human Biology and Society at UCLA, and he is the author of Homesick, which is a fascinating and long-term research, really engaged research project into mapping FEMA trailers and how they've gone throughout the nation and a variety of issues related to that. And I will let him tell you far more about it than I will. But Dr. Nicholas Shapiro, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Absolutely. So just to start off, as I allude to, I mean, this kind of starts with FEMA trailers. I don't want to limit it in just the quick blurb. I think for folks who remember Hurricane Katrina, they may have slight memories of even maybe just the visual of these kind of thousands and thousands of white trailers that materialized across southern Louisiana and Mississippi in the aftermath of that disaster. And maybe they heard some reporting, there was good reporting in years following about some of the consequences of those trailers, but I think that's also something that is often missed or forgotten in the kind of Katrina narrative. So can you just walk us through a little bit what these FEMA trailers were and why they're important to understanding a kind of long legacy of disaster?
It's a great question, and I think your audience knows some of the context that most of the country doesn't know, so I can get a little bit more detailed. But back in 2005, after Hurricane Katrina and then Rita tore into the Gulf Coast, within about 2 weeks of the landfall of Hurricane Katrina, the federal government had secured about $2 billion of no-bid contracts with trailer manufacturers. So there was a lot of money to be made in disaster response. There's a huge demand on indoor grade engineered woods like plywood to build these trailers. Manufactured homes in general use much more engineered woods than a conventional home, and formaldehyde is the binding agent that holds together engineered woods.
Mm.
And indoor grade plywoods they release less formaldehyde into the air. But as a result of the huge need for the manufacture of trailers and the huge need to rebuild homes, the the country's stock of engineered woods was decimated very quickly. And as a result, there's a woman in the trailer building capital of the country in Indiana who found me many years later and admitted that she was forced by her boss to mislabel high formaldehyde emitting plywood as low formaldehyde emitting plywood.
Mm.
And as a result, there is very toxic materials going into these FEMA trailers. We have reports of trailers working 24 hours a day, people, the bosses with bullhorns telling people to go faster. The trailers were so toxic that there's reports of people in the factories bleeding from their ears, bleeding from their noses. This is an acute exposure. And it largely focused on the huge need for housing in the Gulf Coast, but extended to every single person who bought a manufactured home that year. They were all getting this substandard engineered wood. And as a result, the FEMA trailers amount to the largest formaldehyde exposure in our species history. Um, these are the people that survived the most costly natural disaster in our country's history that were then en masse funneled into ostensibly helpful shelter. And this was a huge public health issue. Uh, FEMA basically tried to avoid knowing more about it in order to not respond. They delayed intervening by at least a year and resulting in sort of an untold number of illnesses and deaths. These trailers were then quasi-legally resold across the country following the end of a court order in January 1st, 2010. The trailers had been retained until that time because they were evidence in a massive lawsuit with upwards of 90,000 plaintiffs
Mm.
suing because of their injuries in these mobile homes. And 2010 was the height of the foreclosure crisis. So you have these bare bones homes all of a sudden flooding the secondhand RV market. And as these trailers were resold, they really became a map of housing crises and capital crises across the country. So I saw them being donated to Native nations. I saw them being pulled up to the Bakken shale field in North Dakota, where rural housing prices and rent was higher than Manhattan during the shale gale, the height of the fracking boom there. So in this way, these FEMA trailers that were the scourge and also sort of the backbone of rebuilding at the same
Hmm.
time after the storm, um, that were the scourge of rebuilding at the same time, they became sort of barometers for these various housing insecurities across the country. They were towed to every corner of the country. They were towed into Canada, internationally. And I think the important part of the story is not just to look back now, 20 years later after the storm, but also to understand that the hazards illuminated by the FEMA trailers are the hazards in a lesser degree that we all face. So there were a set of studies in December 2024 that were released by the federal government that together indicate that the average American home has enough formaldehyde in its indoor air to impede respiratory function. So this is not just emergency housing. This
Yeah.
is where we all live as a country. So this botched emergency response in the Gulf South that then was spread across the country and the hemisphere really tells us a lot about the way that shelter has become exposure. And it's all because of our reliance on engineered woods, which really do decrease the cost of housing. They decrease the amount of skill needed to build a home.
Mm.
And it is a real double bind. It's a real paradox about how these engineered woods subsidize our cost of living. They give form to our shelter, and they also are biologically unraveling us.
I want to get into the prevalence of these materials in ordinary homes in a bit, because I think folks are going to be really attentive to thinking about, how is this materializing in my own house? But I want to back up a little bit. And I mean, I'll say on a kind of personal note, having lived through Katrina, I know folks who lived in FEMA trailers. I know folks who at the time were, kind of over the moon when they secured a FEMA trailer.
Mm.
That was considered a big win for a lot of people to be able to come back. As you point to, it was this
Yeah.
kind of the infrastructure of rebuilding. I remember at one point sitting and asking, like, do we need to apply for a FEMA trailer?
Yeah.
And then I have seen these stories unfold over time. But can you walk us through a little bit? What were these homes like when they first arrived for folks? What were the condition? And I think, I'm not exactly sure when you started this investigation, but I know you've been on it for many years. By the time you were seeing them, what was the condition of them? Because I think that's changed rather quickly.
When they were first deployed, the stench was overwhelming often.
Mm.
So exactly as you mentioned, the early protests were really that the trailers were not coming fast enough and not enough people were getting access to them. Um, there's this quote by the Gulf Coast director of FEMA at the time saying, our number one priority is housing, our number two priority is housing, our number three priority is housing. Um, and this is really the crux of rebuilding. And so these like gleaming white boxes that were trucked in, that were on the back of trains, were really the infrastructure of hope, exactly as you say. It was these walls were sort of charged with the task of reinstating the spatial syntax of the city, of like, this is private space, this is public space,
Mm.
this is my home, this is the collective space outside the home. And at that point, people immediately were beginning to have issues, and some people had no issues at all. So some people were fine. Many people described the smell as the new car smell. Some people were
Mhm.
happy about it. Um, and uh, some people said that having their home destroyed was so life destroying that they wouldn't have been able to handle a space bigger than the FEMA trailer, like 250 square feet.
Mm.
Um, And then, whisper networks started to sort of elucidate these hazards. For some people were getting very sick. People were found passed out in their trailers. Animals and pets were getting sick. So
Yeah.
parrots and dogs and cats. And
I mean,
yeah, the
pretty much
quality,
literal canaries in coal mines here.
absolutely. Yeah. And I think that when we zoom out from the FEMA trailers to all of our homes, when we have brain fog, when we have a headache, when we have a nosebleed in our own homes, we might also be canaries in the coal mines of um, 21st century petrochemical infrastructure. But we'll get to that. As they were being resold, many of these trailers were destroyed in the process of people
Mm.
living in them because you would have families of six living in a 250 square foot trailer. So there's all these stories of, trying to take a shower in the tiny shower and duck under the ironing table and like grab a little piece of toast and get to school. Like all of these stories of people really doing their best to navigate these small spaces. But it's a lot of wear and tear. They were built, very quickly, and so they started to fall apart fast. So um, many of the trailers were sold as scrap.
Mm.
Those that were not sold as scrap were uh, a sticker was put in the window saying not to be used for housing. And when I saw those trailers resold across the country, they would be grimy on the outside, everywhere but a little negative space of clean window where that warning sticker had been ripped off. Um, and people were rebuilding them as they could afford. And I really saw every different kind of state of decomposition or pristine, uh, uh, pristine condition as I tracked them across the country. And so I don't think I told you exactly the scale, but so there's 120,000 of these trailers, and so that's some estimate around 300,000 people living in them after the hurricanes, and then another 300,000 people living in them when they were resold.
Okay, so we have several, tens of thousands that are being resold. One of the things that you mentioned is, I mean, the fact that they're able to resell these despite things like stickers that say not to be used as housing. How is it that these are able to be resold? Where is the market, especially? I mean, could you go into this in the book? But I'd love to hear from you. How is it actually possible these are getting resold?
Yeah, I was totally surprised at this rural speculative economy.
Hmm.
There's this idea that fire sale prices coming from a giant federal auction is a place where a lot of money can be made.
Hmm.
And some of these trailers are being sold for as little as $5. So there was money to be made, and there were all kinds of different investors. There were large auction houses that bought lots of thousands to tens of thousands of trailers at a time. And there were smaller mom and pop operations that maybe folks ran. Maybe they ran their own trailer park and they wanted to buy more trailers for their trailer park. Maybe they rented out some trailers and they had part of their lot that was for reselling used trailers.
Hmm.
And all kinds of families and groups of friends and groups of business colleagues would all gather together and buy these trailers and sold them across the country. And I remember one being in Nebraska and talking to someone who was selling these trailers. And when I talked to resellers, they were, understandably cagey with me. But there was this one moment of clarity at the end of the conversation where he admits that he might have actually been taken by the fantasy of profitability because it
Hmm.
just costs a lot of money to move these trailers one by one. Um, and so if you're hauling it all the way up to Nebraska, it is going to be expensive. And so I think there's like a fantasy of profit that many people ran into as they got further and further away from the Gulf Coast.
I'm curious about where is the government in this? Are they aware these are not suitable for housing? And if so, how is it being permitted that these are just getting resold?
And it's a sad answer to that question. Something called the General Services Administration is responsible for selling off excess federal government property. And so the General Service Administration, or GSA, they sold these trailers at auction. And they're the ones who put the stickers in the window, and they're the ones that had a sort of a waiver of liability to be signed by everyone that would purchase these trailers. Um, and when I would call the Inspector General of the General Service Administration, they wouldn't call me back. Um, it was very clear that these the documents that were required to be signed at purchase required every subsequent resale to also have these same papers, and that just
Hmm.
wasn't happening. So these
Hmm.
like continuous disclosures of potential formaldehyde were not being passed down as was stipulated in the sale documents. And when I would t call GSA and report that, they would not do anything. So people would often find me after calling county government, after calling city government, after calling state government, after calling the FBI, after calling the CDC. And they were really there's this search for accountability.
Yeah.
And I remember in 2019, I went to a trailer not far from where I now live in LA, in the high desert, near Victorville, California. And I was testing the trailer. We can get into what I was doing there, but I was testing the trailer for formaldehyde. And as I walked out of the trailer, the woman who lived in the trailer pointed at it and said, "This is your life's work. Who was responsible for this?" And I didn't really have an answer for her. She had that week, I think the week, like right before I showed up at her house, she had gotten a jury summons that she didn't really want to go to, but she knew that she would get in trouble if she didn't go to the jury summons, but she knew that there was no accountability for her regarding the federal government selling a hazardous home to her family. And so those are the like the these eddies in our system of accountability that all these families found themselves in. And time again, I saw people unable to find accountability. and they would often turn to their own psychological practices in order to find peace. It wasn't through the justice system. It wasn't through litigation, this massive tort, toxic tort that I mentioned with over 90,000 plaintiffs, but it was through getting out of the trailer, making peace with the harm that happened, and just trying to keep it moving. And that's the sort of um, the dismal state of justice in this huge, huge catastrophe.
So, I mean, you mentioned going in to these homes, studying them, testing, as you hint at. And I mean, I think folks understand like these were rolled out too hastily. The government seems to have lacked accountability in monitoring once they knew things were going haywire. But you continue to go to these homes to measure, to meet with folks. You mention pets dying, people being ill. But having read the book, I can say, it's really pretty graphic, experiencing what these folks are going through. Can you walk us through a little bit more when you're going into these homes? I mean, there's a really frankly hard to read part about, your own experiences at a certain point of having spent so much time in these houses, having had so much exposure yourself to formaldehyde, the toll that it takes on your body when you walk into one with really high formaldehyde. So can you walk us through both, how much is actually going on here? Because I think those numbers might shock folks, but also what does that do to your body, to the folks who are living here? What is the actual experience of that like?
The biological dysfunction of formaldehyde creeps in slowly. It will begin often with dizziness, brain fog, a headache. Maybe it will result in a small capillary hemorrhage, like a nosebleed.
Hmm.
And then over time, there's this increased deterioration. Formaldehyde's not just an irritant, causing nosebleeds and watery eyes, but it's also an allergen, a neurotoxin, and a known human carcinogen. So, um, people would basically be unraveling slowly. There were a lot of accounts where people were saying that it just felt like they were aging at a faster rate. Nightmares were one of the most surreal and also common symptoms that were reported to me. Um, Diarrhea was pretty omnipresent, and so people would just go on living while their eyes were burning when they would be in their house, while they couldn't sleep because of nightmares, while kids were being sent home from school because of their constant diarrhea. You can think about all of the workplace and educational impacts of people experiencing these often subclinical like symptoms, these things that you're going to get sent home from urgent care about, or you're not even going to want to go to urgent care or see your doctor or hazard that copay. Um, Formaldehyde just became the irritating background noise. And I experienced it to a small degree. I would just be in someone's house for a couple hours, go in and test for formaldehyde. And during that time, I could often feel it in my body as the sensor was registering it in a validated way. And my mind would become woolly. Um, I would get tired. I would have trouble sort of putting sentences together in a logical order. Um, and so I would always be trying to have conversations outside to try and get out of the exposure so I could actually provide better counsel. And this is the same thing that reporters that are friends of mine are experiencing when they're talking to people whose houses burnt down here in LA recently, um, or had smoke damage, where you go into someone's most intimate space, it looks fine, but inside it's hazardous, and you're scared for yourself and you're scared for them, and you can't concentrate in the moments that you need to concentrate the most. Um, And, of course, there were other more grievous injuries, cancers, chronic pneumonia, and often people were experiencing a lot of dermatological issues.
Hmm.
And so skin was tearing, there'd be sores. Uh, And you can sort of understand how maddening that would be, where
Yeah.
you invest all of your money into a home, and a home is that American dream. It is that primary way of building intergenerational wealth. And instead of being on that conveyor belt up that real estate often is, it is, you know, an elevator with its wire cut, and you're shooting down, you're plummeting, and that's often the sort of the experience of people living in acute domestic toxicity. And it was a difficult issue. I think the one good thing about how terribly these trailers were built is that often that's the way exposure ended, where the trailers were just falling apart. So we'd get someone out of a trailer and it would just not be habitable for anyone else to live in, so they could scrap it and sell the chassis or something like that. And that's really like that's the redemption arc, is that these things are built so poorly that they're falling apart on their own.
I think, I mean, there's multiple times you take a lot of samples throughout the course of your work, but I mean, early in the book, there's a point where you talk about a specific formaldehyde test you conducted that yielded, you mentioned the World Health Organization recommendation for formaldehyde exposure. The limit is 81 parts per billion over 30 minutes, and that this test you take is 105 parts per
Mhm.
billion. And I mean, those are pretty common, I'll say, kind of numbers throughout the book, as we're seeing these, sometimes 2 and 3 times the kind of recommended rate. But I think what grabbed me when I first read that, I mean, this is the recommended limit for a half hour. And these are homes. These are where people are spending, the majority of their time. Um,
Absolutely.
and so, I mean, I think about the severity in terms of, yeah, those kind of accumulating effects. And I know the answer to this because I read the book, but I'd love to hear a little bit about the kind of accountability that was there follow up health studies from FEMA or from other groups. What government agencies attempted to understand what the long term health consequences of these conditions were.
Yeah, and thank you for underlining the quantitative part. There, it that in itself is very surreal. There are all of these different guidelines by all of these different countries for all of these different durations of exposure. And in general, in the US, we do our exposure guidelines based upon able-bodied men of working age for 8 hours a day. And so there's just always a discrepancy between the timeline of the maximum recommended level and the experience of people that are, say, retirees that really don't go outside other than to get groceries.
Or kids who are
And
just more vulnerable to these kind of things. I mean, yeah.
absolutely, yeah. So sensitive groups, older people, younger people, um, and even working age able-bodied men who are just in the home more than 8 hours a day. So really everyone isn't protected. And recently, the Trump administration did begin its attempt to deregulate chemicals, beginning with formaldehyde.
Mhm.
And I can talk more about that. And they're basically recommending doubling the minimum exposure level for formaldehyde.
Mhm.
Um, and this is also the trend in Europe. Europe recently doubled the maximum amount of workplace exposure for formaldehyde. Um, So there is a global trend of reducing precaution related to this compound. But in terms of who's studying this, the CDC contracted with something called RTI International. RTI is Research Triangle International. It's a big government contractor that does studies, often health studies. Um, and FEMA funded it, CDC contracted it, RTI ran it. There's a pilot study. Just to basically, the point of the pilot study was, could a study on the epidemiological impacts of kids in these trailers be done? The findings were yes, it could be done. We can locate the people. And when I used the Freedom of Information Act to get those records, CDC was clear that it was not continued, even though it was feasible, because FEMA didn't fund it. So we do not have a record on the epidemiological impacts of these of this largest formaldehyde exposure in our species history. We don't. The lawsuit was pretty disorganized, and we don't really have a good systematic data collection from the lawsuit either. And so the book is really that's the historical record, other than the way that the chemical is cross-linking the DNA of hundreds of thousands of people in the Gulf Coast and leaving a minor, not a minor, a small but important bit of its legacy in the genetic makeup of the whole region.
Well, and I think, I mean, one of the things that points to is, Katrina certainly, if folks are familiar with Hurricane Katrina, they probably think of it as one of the greatest governmental disaster response and infrastructural failures of, certainly this century and well into the previous one is definitely, one of the things we
Mhm.
think about is the failure of Katrina. We don't tend to think as much about the ongoing public health disasters that unfolded afterwards. And I mean, I think for especially in a century where we are seeing increased disasters, or we are seeing more frequent disasters, that, understanding the way that we conduct response, the way that we are prepared for these events, and the way that we go about trying to mitigate the harm of a natural disaster is so critically important, because if we aren't following it up, if we aren't having the kind of accountable governance that we demand and require, that can cause severe ongoing health threats for communities all over the country. And I think that's one of the lessons that is less emphasized or less learned from Katrina that I think is really, really critical. And I'm glad that this book so clearly addresses that and really, maps out a part of that disaster that gets less attention. You've brought up a couple of times, and I do want to turn over to it because I think folks are going to be okay. You've nodded to these kind of VOCs in regular homes. You've talked about formaldehyde in engineered wood, and I mean, I think any of us who have bought, some piece of furniture from Wayfair that's full of MDF is maybe now going like, so how scared should I be of my nightstands?
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about, not just the FEMA trailer of this, but the regular home construction? Where are we seeing these kind of compounds show up in our regular homes, and how worried should we be about them?
Great question. And I think there's so much emphasis on furniture that is a little bit misplaced. No, no, I think you're totally right. It's just the place where we make our decisions as individuals. And it's also, we are usually not involved in the decision of if you're going to have soy-based adhesive in your engineered wood or you're going to have formaldehyde-based adhesive. So we don't really see it. And we have our home sheathed in engineered wood. Our subfloors are all engineered wood usually. And we don't see it. We cover it with uh, drywall and we cover it with flooring of different sort. If it's laminate flooring, that's definitely held together. Not definitely, almost almost definitely. Sorry, a little too intense with my accuracy. Almost definitely held together with formaldehyde. Um, and I think those are the places where that I think about the most because that's contributing the most. So
Mm,
these formaldehyde-based resins are slowly sublimating formaldehyde at room temperature. Sublimation just means the formaldehyde is going from a solid state as an adhesive into a gas state in
mm,
the air. And this is happening millions and trillions of times in the rooms that we're both in this very second. Um, and that is a large contributor. So I recently rebuilt my house and I couldn't afford to use the fancy non-formaldehyde based adhesives. And so when your home is under 5.5 years, you're more likely to have a higher formaldehyde level. So there's like a bit of a sweet spot in terms of the general housing, which is older than 5.5 years, but not older than the mid 80s. And so you, yeah, that's a sweet spot for housing construction where the formaldehyde is off-gassed and the older legacy toxicants like lead paint and asbestos, those are not present. And so if you have a a nice 90s or late 80s or early 2000s house that's a little drafty, there's ways that that's working for you at the same time as it's working against maybe your heating and cooling bill. Yeah, like I said, the average American home has enough formaldehyde to inhibit pulmonary function.
Mm,
And those levels that were put out by the EPA in 2024 are below 10 parts per billion. So, we were talking about hundreds of parts per billion in exposures, and precaution really needs to begin in the tens. And so, we're all living in this a bit of a scientific no man's land where there are studies done about the health of impacts, but probably the formaldehyde allied industries are doing more studies than mainstream toxicology. And so the scientific literature is slowly over time being skewed towards the industry's perspective.
mm,
Um, and science, like anything, has its trends, and certain kinds of single toxicant toxicology are not the trendiest thing, are not the most exciting thing. And so the people that might be funding it the most are our industry. So I suspect that unless there's a real investment in basic toxicology, in multiple exposure toxicology, basically understanding the chemical soup that is our indoor air in its full complexity. Yeah, if we don't have that, I think we're going to continue to see precaution eroded for all of our homes, and we're going to fail to learn the lesson that the FEMA trailers taught us. And I guess one other thing is that the FEMA trailers really did impact our federal regulation on formaldehyde. So the
mm,
first substantial revision of something called the Toxic Substances Control Act, which is our backbone toxics regulation. The first major revision of it was because of formaldehyde, and it was because of the FEMA trailers. And in this petition that led to its passing, the FEMA trailers were called out in the first sentence, sort of like on the backs. This legislation was passed on the backs of that, the acute human suffering from formaldehyde exposure after Hurricane Katrina. And the way we regulate it now is not by what is the level of formaldehyde in your indoor air. Let's get that down, but we regulate individually each individual piece of engineered wood.
mm.
And so you make different spaces with those building materials. You can make a big mansion with a lot of ventilation, and you can make a tiny trailer, like a FEMA home, like a FEMA trailer, with those same materials, and you're going to have a much higher indoor concentration.
Yeah.
And so the major win, like the thing that all of the advocates were celebrating about on this email list that I was on, uh, when that was passed in 2010, I, it also was a moment when the FEMA trailers were the spaces, or all trailers were the spaces that were most abandoned by that regulation. So it's a regressive regulation that, because it's not actually a health-based standard of the air inside the home, the smaller, poorer, I guess the smaller, lower income housing with less ventilation and more engineered woods, it's intrinsically going to be more toxic. And so there's real difficulties in how we move from a commodity-based regulation to health-based regulations in private space. And there's a lot of barriers to that. We see domestic space being a place where violence can happen on an interpersonal level, like domestic violence. And laws have historically not been regulating that kind of violence. And we also have a molecular kind of domestic violence that is happening, and our regulatory apparatus is really not rising to the challenge.
I want to ask in a second about what I think is probably the more real answer to how we address some of this, which is kind of what should some of those regulations be. But I want to put a pin in that just for a minute to first ask, only because you do allude to both in the book in different ways. Two things that I think people maybe have heard of or tried in their own homes to, if they are thinking at all about the air quality of their homes. One of which is plants. I think a lot of folks have heard, house plants help the air quality of your home, and you do talk about, how real is that, and how we might imagine that in our home spaces. And then the other one that you talk about a little bit, just the good old fashioned opening up of windows and letting in
Mhm.
fresh air. The New York Times gave us an article a few weeks ago about house burping, and ever since, I keep hearing everyone from my parents to my students talking to me about house burping. So I guess we have to say that on the airwaves now. But are these actual things that can help mitigate some of the harm that's in the air in our home? Or are they real solutions? Or are these maybe things we're investing a little too much faith in?
Yeah, I think that the most common one that you might hear is little advertisements you get in a Home Depot or your local nursery where it says buy this clean air, buy this plant and you can clean your air. Um, and Interestingly, that science comes from Mississippi. It comes from the Stennis Research Center, which is our rocket testing facility for NASA down in Mississippi. At Stennis, in the visitor center, there was this thing called the biohome. The biohome was this home that was a model home for the future colonization of the cosmos that used plants to mitigate all of the hazards from the synthetic materials used to build it. And so the scientists talk about when you would walk into the biohome, your eyes would water and the mass specs would register all kinds of VOCs in the air. And so they filled half of it with plants and they locked a grad student in it for a summer and the mass specs came
Things
out
we do to
clean.
grad students. Oh my God.
Yeah, one of the many violations of graduate students. But the graduate student was fine, apparently. So says the PI. But that is also essentially a mobile home that was destroyed by Hurricane Katrina. So that doesn't exist anymore because it was destroyed by Katrina. And then all over Picayune, Mississippi, right next to Stennis, is our FEMA trailers. So we swapped out this certain kind of mobile home for another, and we have a specter of a misinterpreted NASA science about what plants can really do to clean our homes.
Hmm.
Basically, if you were to buy the line of buying a plant to clean your air, you would need hundreds of plants to the point that it would probably change the moisture levels in your house and you'd get a bunch of mold. So I do not recommend the idea of using plants to clean your air. Studies have revealed that it's the bacteria in the rhizosphere that pull much of the weight of metabolizing formaldehyde. And so the rhizosphere is basically like every root ball of a plant is cultivating bacteria in its roots. It's feeding them with certain things it's exuding. It's also killing other kinds of bacteria. And it cultivates a very specific microbiome. And those bacteria often have not, it's they often upregulate their metabolism to eat more formaldehyde when they're exposed to it. So one idea that was sort of lost in the transition between the biohome and Home Depot is that the NASA scientist that was first figuring out that plants might clean the air, he moved air through the root system. So he created a special kind of pot that moved the air through the root system. And that increased, he says, the potential to clean air by 100-fold.
Wow.
So basically, he says that it's a diffusion limitation and not a metabolic limitation, right? So it's a limitation on the amount of air that touches the bacteria and not what the bacteria can actually destroy. So I spent a lot of time trying to build those systems and replicate them, and figure out tools that would render myself unnecessary. I knew that my grant funding would run out, and I knew I couldn't just be tracing trailers for the rest of my life. So I wanted to create real systems that would help people endure these exposures. And we built a low-cost kit, and there's designs online, and we tested it, and it seemed actually rather impactful, sort of speeding up the decline in formaldehyde exposure. I think ultimately I'm not a good enough capitalist. I tried to openly license everything, and it I think if I'd gone a different route, it might be in your, uh, we're speaking on video, and I can see a plant in the background of your video, and you might have that planter if I was able to mass produce it, make it cheap, make it accessible. But my plans involve going around to a bunch of different box stores, spending your whole weekend, growing a hydroculture plant and finding sort of sometimes rarefied materials. And it's cheap, but it's not cheap on time.
Yeah.
And if you're someone who's experiencing acute exposure, you're really not going to be like, you're not going to have the time to run around and build this thing that you found on this obscure blog. So I think that's one of the moments of the book where I really, I think I failed to mitigate harm because I failed to be a good capitalist. I failed to get this product out in the market, and to meet people where they're at. And so, yeah, it's one of the many ethical dilemmas that I faced in doing this research. And surprisingly, we also tested the microbiome of the home. I was sort of worried that we'd build this plant air purifier, and sure, the if it worked, there'd be less formaldehyde, but I'd potentially be spreading a bunch of bacteria and a bunch of viruses all over the home that are in the soil. So I was, positive that I was going to kill people by, you know, exposing immunocompromised people to the kind of bacteria that doesn't get you or I sick, but might kill someone who's older or immunocompromised. And surprisingly, I found that the bacterial and viral loads went down dramatically in the microbiome of the home. So we only did preliminary testing at a few different locations, but that was heartening. And we're working also on building lower cost testing tools, and that is going on. We were, on our third grant. R&D takes a long time, um, and we don't yet have something that people can buy, although I've been thinking it's around the corner for almost a decade. So, these are all of the endeavors that stretch this book from being a 5-year write to being a 15-year write,
Yeah.
where I was trying to initially just collect stories and see what happened, understand people's experiences in both the original deployment of the trailers and the resale. And then it spiraled into this 15-year saga where I'm retraining as an environmental engineer, where I'm learning how to sample microbiomes of homes and soil. And I think that's where I think methodologically the book is probably most interesting.
I mean, it's really fascinating. I'll say, as a scholar, the kind of work that you're doing, thinking across disciplines, is really rare and really fascinating. And I think the way that you grapple with the ethics of the work, which I will also just say, I don't think anybody expects it to fall on you solely to fix this massive government problem that has affected, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. But I commend you on all the work that you've done on behalf of the folks who've suffered under these conditions. I want to go real quick, and just for those who are anxious about it, raising our windows periodically, good or bad for those kind of VOCs in our house.
Yeah, thank you. In my notes, I just was underlining that. I need to come back to it. So that's very helpful. So complicated answer as always. It's the realistic answer is the complicated answer. And so in general, dilution is the solution for
Mm,
sure. It's a great motto, but it depends where you live. I remember being is it Pasadena, one of the
yeah,
suburbs of Houston,
absolutely.
in a trailer park that's right around a bunch of refineries, and the idea that you can ventilate with cleaner air is true
Mm.
for some, but not all. And so it depends where you live. It depends how clean your outdoor air is. And there's at least one study that modeled ventilation as a long-term solution, and it found that over time, uh, ventilation did have shortcomings as a long-term solution to formaldehyde. This was modeled and not empirical, so I don't exactly understand the mechanisms involved, but um, there's all basically your home is ventilating itself at all times. So over time, the store of formaldehyde that can wriggle free of its bonds is going to decrease. Um, and so in general, it is going in the right direction. Ventilation is a great thing, especially for um, acute exposures or when you're feeling particularly ill. One other thing to avoid is that formaldehyde's attracted to water. And so you can, I think all of us have seen at some point some engineered wood in a yard somewhere that's been rained on and expands and is falling
Yeah.
apart and brittle. And that's because the water has helped release the bonds of formaldehyde. And so what was found in a CDC study on the FEMA trailers is that where there was mold, there was more formaldehyde in the home. So mold needs water to grow, and that water that makes mold grow also releases more formaldehyde into the indoor air.
Mm.
So ventilation in your bathroom, fixing a leaky roof, fixing a leaky pipe, um, ventilating your basement if you're in a region that has basements. Those are all really important steps, not only to mitigating mold, but also formaldehyde that is increasing when moisture increases.
Good to know. All right, last question quickly, because I know we're running out of time. But I mean, you alluded some to changing policies. Really, it sounds globally in terms of kind of raising some of those caps. What are some of the policy solutions for this? What are some of the things we should be thinking about that we could do to try to make our homes a little bit healthier and safer?
It's a great question, and as always, it's a hard question because it I'll talk first as if there were no logistical hurdles, like
Sure.
pie in the sky.
Fantasy world, yeah.
Yeah, a fantasy world, like not even a total fantasy world, just like within our current regulatory apparatus, what would be amazing if it was possible? And I think a health-based standard based upon um, the impacts of multiple different kinds of sensitive groups.
Hmm.
I think we probably want to have a home that its health standard is based upon raising children or having elderly people grow old safely.
Yeah.
Um, and so a health-based standard that would include the actual level of formaldehyde in the indoor space and not just regulating the commodities that assemble that space. I think that's what we want. And we want it to be precautionary enough that you can raise kids in it safely and that you can grow old in it safely. Um, and so that would be difficult because of the variety of homes. There's different homes. Who do we regulate? Like who do you regulate? Do you regulate the contractor? Do you regulate the architect? And so these are the kind of practicalities that would really need to be worked out. I'm sure there'd be huge pushback, and everyone would try to get the other, in the other party regulated and not themselves. But that would be incredible, and it would be probably disastrous for the manufactured home market. And the manufactured home market is the largest form of unsubsidized low-cost housing in the entire country. 20 million people live in manufactured housing. So there are a lot of different problems to realizing that, and there would need to be a stepped approach. The formaldehyde regulations to TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act, that were put in place by Hurricane Katrina might be baby steps towards a more fundamental change, like the one I'm talking about. So there's ways to scaffold an unrolling of a more precautionary regulation that won't destroy economies, that won't make housing even more unaffordable than it already is. And I think large investments at the governmental level in building housing would help protect the public from the housing cost increases of regulating this omnipresent chemical more fastidiously.
That's terrific. I mean, it seems like something we could actually build to as well, which is encouraging. Dr. Nicholas Shapiro is the author of Homesick. You can read all about his many years researching FEMA trailers and volatile chemicals that are in our homes throughout the book. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Shapiro. It has been a delight getting to chat with you about a difficult and troubling subject, but one that I think is really significant, especially for those of us on the Gulf Coast.
Yeah, thank you so much.
That's our show for this week. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westonT@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Original music by Carter Dean. Research support provided by Sarah Tabrez and Antara Varma. Stay tuned for No Expectations with Marcus French, here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.